Hello everybody and welcome to our final session this afternoon of the curated part of the programme anyway, at the International Literature Showcase. A lot of what we've presented to you so far has been really firmly rooted in the literature sector. And so this afternoon we wanted to shake it up a little bit and with a new format and get you to think about your work in new ways. Working in groups, I just want to say this is a really equal platform for discussion and it's going to benefit from the expertise that we have in the room from all around the world. So we want everyone to contribute. Please make your voice heard. I'm really pleased this afternoon to present... Excellent, exactly like that. I'm really pleased to present Sarah Thelwall this afternoon. Sarah has a visual arts background, as you might be able to see, and has been working with creative entrepreneurs for the last sort of decade or so. She specialises in marketing and finance and focuses on enabling entrepreneurs in the sector to understand and maximise the money that flows through their business without losing their souls in the process. You all know each other by now. And I hope that this session will help you to distill all the conversations that you've had over the past few days. What might you hang a collaboration on? And with so many synergies, what exactly are you going to focus on when you leave here? So I hope that Sarah will help you think about some of those questions in more detail. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Sarah. Thank you.
Hi. So the format of this is going to be about 20 minutes of me talking, chucking some ideas at you, and hopefully some of them will seem relevant. And then we'll move into a workshop format for about an hour or so. Yes, I'm not a literature person. In fact, I'm a biologist. One of those random facts of life. The work that I do that I hope will be relevant this afternoon is I look at the way in which business models are changing in non-profit arts organisations, and my goal is to help make them more sustainable, usually through reducing dependency on grant funding, but not always. So I'm going to kind of run through about 10 years worth of work to start with in about 20 minutes. And one of the things that comes out of this is a difference between small organisations and large organisations, and that a little place is not a mini-me version of a big place for all sorts of reasons that I will do my best to touch on. We're going to cover that lot. We can ignore it. Idea number one. The first order activities of an arts organisation, for me, is the kind of the creative core. It's the reason you get up in the morning. It's often, but not always, grant funded, sometimes by governments, sometimes by NGOs. And it's not expected to generate a financial return. It is expected to generate a cultural return and a social return, but part of the reason this stuff gets grant funded is because there is a market failure, and yet we need the work to occur. It's also, those first order activities, they're intrinsically connected to the labour force that delivers them, i.e. you guys. And, relatively speaking, you're an expensive commodity. By the way, I think we should all be a more expensive commodity, but, relatively, we're expensive because we're the ones making the work in the first place. Now, having generated those assets over time, the question that I want to pose is to say, what else can we do with them? So the second order activities and assets are about saying, that stuff you just created, what more can we do with it? How can we turn those assets into other forms of income? Now, if I look at, you walk into any museum or gallery, particularly any large one in the UK, and it's pretty much always got a shop and a cafe. Those, for me, are two examples of venue-based second-order activities. And they're quite easy ones to see. But I also want to have a look at some of the intangible assets, because I suspect that there's quite a lot of those in the room as well. So the first idea I want to set up with you is this difference between the first order stuff, created because it's what you get out of bed in the morning to do, and the second order stuff that I hope is there to make things more sustainable. Idea number one. examples of this, the difference between the exhibition and the merchandise. And one of the other things that matters in this is that for those second order activities to work, you've got to find a way of disconnecting them from the labour force so that you can sell them in greater volume. There's only so many concerts an orchestra can give, but it can sell a lot more CDs. So that's the principle I want to establish there. Because the trouble is, however brilliant you are at writing funding applications, unless you're in Beirut where there was never any government money for it in the first place, there's less of that government money around. And anyway, it only paid for a proportion of things. It's never exactly a pot that's overflowing. So, and it's all what I'd call supply-side economics. There's a limited amount of it, and you try and stretch it as far as possible. Whereas if we can do some of that second-order stuff that's working in a demand-side economy, then hopefully that's the stuff that's got some scale to it. Nice idea, Sarah. What about the practicalities? Two pieces to sort of seed with you before I move on to a couple of examples. This first-order stuff, the revenue is connected to the cost of production, whereas over there the revenue is linked to the market demand. This is limited by a set of supply-side economic factors. That's driven by the demand side. Nice in theory. By the way, I have a few thanks to offer at this point, because this is work that's evolved over a 10-year period, and I need to name check a few people who helped me get my head straight about it. All three of them are visual arts organisations. Proboscis, you know quite well, are an interesting bunch. Scan's not around anymore, and Blast Theory still is. They're three of the small organisations that helped me get these ideas together. Two examples. Neither of them ones I know terribly well, both of them ones I've learned in the last week, both of them literature. Lola's not in the room today, unfortunately, but she and I were having a conversation the other week. This is a festival in Nigeria, and we were talking about what her first order and second order activities are and how that's enabling her to grow. So, unsurprisingly, she's got a bunch of grants, mostly NGO grants, and a certain amount of sponsorship that's paying for the festival and the commissioning that's involved in that, and the videoing, the digitisation, and all the kind of the making the thing in the first place. And what she's looking at over on that side is what are the book sales, what publishing can she set up, how can she set revenue-generating activities that will feed their profits back into that core so she can do more of it. And here's where she's got in the first 3 years. Year one, she invested her own funds in doing it. She managed to cover all but 12 grand's worth of costs. The trouble was that there was no funds left over to carry her through the year. So she funded the thing, but there was none of that stuff going on, so she couldn't fund anything more than doing the thing. Not a bad start, mind. What she did manage to fund was the filming and editing of a load of footage of the festival so that she could keep building the interest through the year, so that when she got to do the second one, it was a bigger and better festival in the first place. It's also established a bunch of relationships, and she's getting quite a lot of in-kind as well as cash, so she's getting the telecoms people to give her a load of SIM cards, a lot of Wi-Fi, etc., all of which does have a value in the delivery of the thing itself. So she's got to this point where the festival's doing well, thanks very much, but she can't really afford the staff base through the year. So its sustainability is a bit of a problem. She's working on it. Her goal this year is to raise enough funds to cover the staff cost in between festivals and to set up the shop and the publishing so that she's got those incomes through the year as well. And to convert some of the in-kind sponsors into cash would be a good idea. And when she can do that, then she's going to be looking at how she raises funds to pay for another member of staff. So there's still going to be a need to keep funding that core through sponsors and grant funding. That's not likely to go away, but if she can do some of those second order things, she's got more sustainability through the year rather than it being a kind of hit and hope, lose your freelancers one year to the next and have to rebuild again. So that's example number one. And she's looking for being about 60% grant dependent rather than 90 to 100% grant dependent. So there's a clear goal in there for the level that feels about right for them. I think you've heard a certain amount about Unbound, and Matthew's not in the room either, so I can say what I like about them both. We've been talking about how they set up a combination of 3 founders and some investment cash, angel-based equity investment in a for-profit organisation, which paid for the initial setup of the platform, the early commissioning, all the kind of, and they're now building the multimedia stuff in so they can do their own film stuff, and all the sort of audience development. So that core asset of doing the thing has had a bunch of cash put into it. Of course, what they're looking to do as they grow is to say, well, evidently, they want to sell a load of books, and they want some of that advanced subscriptions because it pays for it in the beginning, but they're also looking at further editions, repeating of things, scaling up consultancy, so building more of that lot so that some of the profits can fund the key resources. I think I've probably said quite a lot of that. And I think, you know better than I do whether these are a good deal for the author or not. But the other things that we were talking about was this sense of the contractual structure is a 50-50 profit split, and it's also about failing faster. So you're much more exposed to the market. It's got its upsides, which is that when it goes well, you build this trust and you build people who want to come back to you. The downside is you might find that nobody actually wants to buy a book, thanks very much, and in which case it doesn't get funded and printed in the first place. So it's not an easy model, but I think it has some interesting things to offer. And that's what I mean when I say there are both intentions and consequences of this that require writers to be much more involved and to think about whether this will work for them or not. But I think an interesting contribution. So, all very nice. What are we going to do about it? How do you decide which second-order activities are right for your organisation or your career as an individual? And one of the things that I find myself answering quite often is that I talk to creative people, particularly curators, creative directors, and they go, look, honestly, this feels like it's an ugly financial wart on the creative face of the organisation. Can I avoid it? My message to you is it's your choice. I think this offers some interesting possibilities, and when you do it well, they can return not just cash but new audiences back into the organisation. So I think it's worth a look. You need to decide whether you agree with that or not. I think it's also about working out which things you do so that you don't invest in something that's got naff all chance of delivering a return in the long term. And that takes a bit of work because the type of risk that you're taking here is different. It's not so much the creative risk that you're all familiar with, but it's the financial risk and it's the betting on something. And because it's not because some of this also involves things like loan finance and equity finance, you've got to generate the return, or you've got to be capable of generating a return before you get the money in the first place. So it feels much more which comes first, does it work? So there's a learning curve in there that I'm not going to go into today. What I am going to do is say, here's a few suggestions for what I think some of the assets are. You might want to make a note of the ones that seem most relevant to you, because when we come to the table discussions, I think you might need one or two of them. The tangible assets are kind of the obvious stuff. They're the buildings, they're the back catalogue, the publications, the archives, the collections, the physical stuff. The intangible assets, about experience and expertise and reputation and goodwill, the intellectual property and the research skills they feel more nebulous, but oh boy, is there a lot of value in those. Because in many cases, this is what, it's your experience and your track record in doing these things that gets you the grant funds. So I'd like there to be, one of my Change the World things is, please can we recognise these assets more, because there's a heck of a lot of them, and we forget them awfully easily. Because they're not buildings that look ugly when they're empty kind of thing. I have a whole diversion on that I'm not going to go into. Here's a bunch of ideas for...
Sorry, can you flip back?
Oh, yep.
So he's going to get some of Sorry.
You're going to get a copy of the slides. You're going to be able to download it all, so pick the ones you want for now. Enough? Got it?
Thank you.
Yep.
Go.
Okay. I thought I'd also chuck in some ideas of the sorts of things that I would have thought you can turn these assets into as revenue streams. There's lots of obvious stuff in here. I'm not going to give you too much of an egg-sucking lesson, I hope. Of course, the catalogue is about the things that you publish, but it's also about the digital versions of those, the other forms of assets they can be turned into. So I know you are thinking about more than physically printed books, but this is just a reminder. The building stuff, you know, when galleries first started doing the sort of Tate-sized catering operations, that was about them saying, what else do we do with the building? And the sort of, you can get married in these spaces and, you know, you can sell it to all sorts of people, conferences, etc. So if you have a venue, great. If you don't, you can ignore this lot. Here's some of the other stuff. So I did some work with an organisation called Lux, who were specialists in artists' video work. And one of the things they do is they sell their time as consultancy. And they sell it at a decent daily rate, rather than what I think a lot of us are in the habit of doing, which is somebody asks you, can you give them a hand? And you give them a bunch of time. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't give away your time, but I am saying there are times when some of it should be charged for. Not always, but think about, is this a place I should charge for it? There are also examples of the public sector contracts that might take us out of the arts. So I'm thinking of a dance organisation called Dance United. Their work is paid for by the Ministry of Justice. It's paid for by the MOJ because they're delivering work to youths who've been in the justice system, and it reduces reoffending rates. Now that money pays for a 12-week professional dance course, because they can prove that it reduces reoffending rates. For me, that does something really interesting in that it demonstrates the use of these creative skill sets in a totally other place. There's another arts organisation that talked about how the sculpture that they put into a place reduced teen pregnancy by 90-something%. So, and by the way, the reports they write with the research that proves these are quite interesting reading. I'll happily follow up on that one. But meanwhile, I shall move on. There's giggling going on here. Another area, research and universities and the access to research money because they need to deliver impact, and oh boy, are we good at it. Where are the opportunities for arts organisations to be part of the research team, and how can we get that work paid for? And are there countries around the world that will pay for this? Does the work get done in the UK? Does the work get done elsewhere? Which academic institutions pay for it? Whole kind of set of questions in there that I think are worth a look, and perhaps also some of the possible collaborations. A friend of mine, Giles from Proboscis, is out in Papua New Guinea at the moment. He's spending 5 weeks in some bit of jungle in Papua New Guinea. That work is paid for by, I think it's Australian and UK universities, but it's delivering value in Papua New Guinea. So I think with all the people around the tables, I would be asking the question of where does the work happen and where does the funding happen, because the two may not be the same. I think I've been through quite a lot of that. I'm going to keep moving on. Here's a summary. Supply-side economics on this side, the grant-based stuff, make the most of it. That demand-side stuff, work out which bits are right for you. Key ideas so far, and some places where you can go read more about them later. The difference between first-order and second-order activities. Working out which sets of tangible and intangible assets you have, and which of these are right for venue and non-venue based organisations. another thing that I'm going to do no detail on but throw at you is I wrote a paper a few years ago called Size Matters, and it was about the role of small visual arts organisations. And what it's really saying, and I think there is a significant difference here between visual arts and literature, but we can test it out. In the visual arts, the people who commission new work are usually in fairly small organisations with a turnover of less than $500,000 and less than 5 staff. And the work that they do that's commissioned today might take 1, 2, or even 3 decades before all of the value in that has really been made visible. So an example from the visual arts is to say that 20 years ago, Rachel Whiteread was commissioned to make Ghost. She's since then had a 4th Plinth, a Turner Prize, XYZ other prizes. She's represented by galleries. She's collected all over the place. But we didn't know that. Nobody knew that when she was commissioned. So it took 20 years for that value to be made apparent. I'm guessing, that a lot of the organisations you represent do a huge amount of deferred value creation. But the trouble is, how do you realise that value? Because Chisenhale is still small. It's still turning over less than $1 million a year. But Tate, that turns over 150 million a year, is an amazing value realiser, because they can do the big sponsors, the big catering operations, all these other things that extract lots of value. So the other reason that I would say that these small organisations need to keep being grant funded is because you're creating the beginning of that. You're doing the stuff that 20 years from now, there will be value that can be realised from it. So I think I'd ask the question about, are you a value realiser or are you a deferred value creator? Or can you be both? ? Don't know. Not quite sure in the literature sector. Just leave that one hanging. That's the paper. Go download it later. So here's some other questions to be thinking about. What is the role and how are the roles of small and large organisations different? You know that better than I do. I'm hoping I might learn from you along the way. How do we monetise some of these intangible assets in a way that supports the first order activities rather than feels like the prostituting of your best ideas? And what are the implications of deferred value creation on the literature supply chain? I know not the answers, but I'd like to have the discussion. Some other things to think about that influence the way that you behave. Small organisations are often incredibly flexible. You will shape the organisation around your projects in a way that the big guys just can't. There's lots of mentoring and the development of the early work, and things aren't always fully resolved when they're first shown. And it's much more process-focused than it is output-focused. Does any of this ring any bells? Oh, that's a relief. Thank heaven for that. So there's some differences that matter in here, and they matter also when you're collaborating. Because if you're going to collaborate with the big guys, knowing what you're better at than they are, what they're inflexible on, where they can bring in great marketing, where they've got big budgets for things that you just haven't, think about those things and see yourselves as peers rather than big guy, little guy. Quite hard to do. Kind of need the big guys to see it that way as well, because, again, I shall not digress off in that direction about whose brands get priority. But it proves challenging.
Sarah, what do you mean by the investment life?
Yes. Not all organisations live forever. Not all organisations need to live forever. But there is a period, if we think about a 20-year lifespan, you can have too much money too soon, but you can also have not enough money at your middle stage and if you don't have enough money as you grow, then you can't turn these assets into other things. So we need to think about the lifetime of an organisation, not just a kind of 1 year after another. So think about the age and state of the organisation and where it wants to go next and what it's developed the ability to do that it can only do because it's 10 years more and more old that it couldn't do when it first started. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
ish. That's what I mean about, think about the life cycle of an organisation and the times at which, as it grows, it will need more to achieve its capacity. Whereas what tends to happen is people get stuck. I'm working with a small visual arts organisation that is getting a tiny amount of money by comparison to its peers, and that's holding it back. Now, for the first 2 or 3 years, that's kind of not surprising because they were new and who would take the risk on them. But, you know, there's a point at which 50 grand a year, when everyone else is getting 250, really gets in the way of things. So if I was wearing my data nerd hat, which I will happily wear separately, I would say you need to compare your income levels to the people in your peer group, because if you're trying to achieve the same as them but on a fifth of the money, it's going to be challenging. So it's worth looking at what else is around and making the case that says, no, really, 50 grand a year, hopeless. 250 a year, much more like it. And one of the things that I think we're not yet good enough at in the sector is to use the sorts of data that is around. I happen to be a data nerd about profit and loss information, to make our case more forcefully about how much we do deliver, how tiny a budget we deliver it for, how far the money goes, what the average, there's lots in there that I think we could do more with. And I will happily have separate data nerd conversations with anyone who's willing to do so. I'm going to carry on from that. The implications of deferred value. For me, this is not just about recoupment. It's not just about saying, we put this much into the project as a grant, when it sells, can we have some back? Because you're delivering so much more value than that. So it's not just about getting the costs back, it's about saying, without this, you couldn't have gone over there. And therefore, we deserve a bit of that. Now, the advantage that you have in literature is that you're very good at handling the IP, and the IP travels with the product, not with, in the visual arts, it's held by the artist, and the people who fund it don't see any of that benefit later on. So what are the things that the IP structures in literature enable you to do that we can't do, say, in visual arts? ? Is it about the kind of equity stake in the work and how that's reflected in the contractual structures? Don't know. Is it also about the difference between the main piece of work and the other formats that it is translated into, and how do we write that into the contracting structures at the beginning? Maybe you're doing all of this, but maybe this is just a checklist to say, should I sort this stuff out? I thought the last thing I'd do was to chuck a bit of data at you. So what I've done is I've taken the profit and loss information on as many of the UK delegates as possible, because I can get their information off the web, and it's all in English, so I can handle that. So here's a few things that I've learned about the UK literature organisations. You're more successful when it comes to raising money that's other than national portfolio than the rest of the arts. So I'm glad you think that's a good thing, because at the moment all I'm going to do is throw the facts at you and you tell me whether you like it or don't. I think these are pieces of good news. You are more successful than the national average at raising money from trusts and foundations. So there's obviously a skill set for that in the room. If you have a cafe, it does as well as anybody else's. That's not to say it's necessarily a raging success. But if you rent out space, you're also pretty good at that as well. Now, there's a few things that might be skewing this data, because the free word centre's in here, and that changes all sorts of things. You're also remarkably good at raising money from membership and subscriptions. And I can tell you the rest of the sector, hopeless. It's the difference between 14% and 4%. Generally speaking, I'd say membership, but, awful lot of wasted energy. But you guys are very good at it.
Can I just ask, was that compared to the rest of the UK literature sector, or compared to other art sectors?
Compared to other art sectors. So I've got about 10 or 12 organisations worth of data that's all literature, and is essentially people who are here, against my 500 organisations worth of data across all sectors. Yes?
It's worth saying, I think you've maybe got 2 NPOs in the room, is that right?
I've got more than 2 NPOs in the data set.
So it's not just the people in the room?
It's the people who were invited. Who were invited, yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. No membership organisations. Mm-hmm.
Well, it depends. We have friends, or we have, but it's only a small part.
How many do you see? Show hands. So 4 or 5.
4 or 5.
So
You're more successful than most other sectors, is what I'd say. And
very small.
a very small example, and I would say treat this data with care, because as it is a small cluster, it may not be representative. It's just some things to play with.
Can I ask a boring question? Are you using just Outcomes England money here, or is it just English organisations, or did you take Wales and Scotland?
No, I've got Wales and Scotland where I can. Yeah. Don't ask me which ones, but yes.
Sorry, just one more thing. It includes places like the Roundhouse, which, because there's a lot of delegates in the room that are not just from a purely literature.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that would skew the data.
Yes, and there's lots more conversation we could have about the difference between literature-only organisations and bigger organisations, some of which is literature. So yes, there are lots of ifs, buts and maybes in here. If you want something more precise, I'll happily have the conversation about it. Yeah. You're more dependent on grants than the national average. Does that sit with your understanding? Okay. Shop and retail's not worth much. Somehow I thought it would be. Not great success with donors and sponsors. Again, I can't offer you a reason why that is. I can merely say, is it worth doing something about that? By the way, that national average is only 6.5%, so all the shenanigans about improving private donations, it's not the be-all and end-all. It doesn't solve everything. If you've had a 30% cut and the national average from donations is 6%, it's not going to fill the gap. So there's a certain kind of careful what you wish for in here, and be careful where you spend your energy. And here's some stuff that I really don't know what it means. There doesn't seem to be much money for research. That could be that I haven't seen it in the data and you do it, but it's not sitting in the profit and loss accounts. The money for education and participation isn't showing separately in the profit and loss sheets. Doesn't mean you don't do it, but it does mean I can't see it. So don't know what's going on there. You have a slightly higher spend on marketing than other sectors. I would see that as a good thing. I think arts marketing doesn't get enough of a budget. So there's a bunch of stuff. Yes?
I just want to add something. So from the Arts Council, from our data, the
Mm-hmm.
literature sector, education, participation spend is high.
Okay,
Higher than the-
good.
So I think be careful about that one.
Yeah,
It's hidden somewhere.
yeah. Here's a bunch more resources. I'm very happy to talk data when it comes to the culture benchmark. We've done a dashboard of the Arts Council England's data for 2011-12 that will show those differences, and we're about to launch the one for 12-13. So if you want to muck about with that data, we can do that. And that's just the what I'm wearing list, because, I can. That's me. I'm very happy to talk about these things. That's kind of the end of the live streaming stuff, and we're going to go into the workshop. So I'll say thanks very much and goodbye to the folks online. And now we're going to move into the...